Back in 1994, 18-year-old Bonnie Craig was a well-liked college freshman at the University of Alaska in beautiful Anchorage. And at about 5 a.m., before dawn, on the morning of September 28, 1994, Bonnie took off on foot through the darkness and made the walk that she would make 2 days a week to the bus stop. These must have been mornings that she couldn't get a ride to the bus stop, so she would walk. She was very diligent student that would always make sure she made it to class early to start the day before 7 a.m., and this was not going to be any different for her. She was on her way, and it seems as though she made it to the bus stop, but never made it to school. And tragically, her body would be found soon after, floating in McHugh Creek. And the medical examiner would determine that she had drowned, but also that she had suffered severe head injuries, possibly resulting from a fall off of a cliff. And you have to wonder how she made it 10 miles away from the bus stop, at the bottom of a cliff in a creek, and these are things that her mother Karen would wonder. However, the police would initially rule this an accident, and it makes no sense, flat out. I mean, she was a very reliable and consistent young woman who always made it to school, and for her, the idea that she would just take off in the darkness and go for a random hike and fall off a cliff makes no sense. And Karen, her mother, was very upset with police work initially in this, for good reason, because also the police did not tell her that she had been sexually assaulted for 6 months, and didn't relay information to the public that she had been sexually assaulted and killed until 3 years later. And so they get a very late start to this case, and basically Karen, her mother, has to go on an investigation of her own, and that's where this thing takes twists and turns, because it turns out that Bonnie's mother, Karen, had worked for the volunteers for the police department as an undercover police officer, as a volunteer. She was a real estate agent by trade, but also did this side work as an undercover officer, and she'd helped to take down a drug organization during one of her sting operations. And now she's talking after her daughter's death to this informant who's telling her that this may have been perpetrated by the drug lord as a means of telling the police to back off. Like, they may have killed her daughter, found out her identity, that she had helped to take down some of their members, and lashed out and killed her daughter in retaliation. She's relaying this information to the police, and they're saying, well, who's the informant? And she's saying, well, I can't give that up, because look what happened. If I give more names up, who knows what's going to happen to me? And so they don't follow up on that. That never comes to fruition. And then another potential suspect comes forward. The college, the University of Alaska that Bonnie had gone to, one of the professors there comes forward a year after her death and says that there was a student that was pretty suspicious in this professor's opinion. One of the students she suspected may have been involved in Bonnie's murder, according to the behavior. According to the professor, this student had made several references to the day of Bonnie's death in his journal, claiming that it would be a very tough day and that he would be put to a test. And according to Karen, some of his writings were also violent. This professor claimed that the student was also late for the school on the day of Bonnie's death, and that when he came to class, she noticed that he was wet, like he had just gotten out of a shower, and also said that he smelled like he had poured an entire bottle of cologne on himself. So Karen is relaying this information to police as well, and they would follow up on this, and he would be ruled out due to DNA evidence and also an alibi. So once again, dead end. And until 3 years later, when police finally, in September of 1997, acknowledged that to the public that Bonnie had been raped and beaten before her death. So basically, she was raped and murdered. And now the public in Anchorage knows that there is a violent offender out there that killed a young woman. And it's now they're basically asking the public for any witnesses that may have seen Bonnie on that morning. A few do come forward, but now we're talking 3 years later. Their memory's a little fuzzy. One witness says that they may have seen Bonnie at a bus stop talking to two men in a car, but this being 3 years later, don't remember the make and model, the color, license plate, and this goes nowhere. And it would ultimately lean on DNA to finally catch this killer. DNA that had been taken from the body of Bonnie and stored would be later entered into CODIS, the DNA database. And this would finally catch the killer, because the police, their job was not done well. And so thankfully technology and DNA would finally connect the killer to the crime scene. In November of 2006, 12 years after the murder, the DNA was matched to 36-year-old Kenneth Dion. He had been in prison at the time that his DNA was connected for a series of armed robberies when the match was made, and at the time of the murder, he lived in the area and was on probation for robbery. This is one of the more frustrating things in studying true crime, is when we see a violent offender released on probation and then they go, and because they feel like they have nothing to lose, they're probably going to end up back in prison anyway. They have no prospects, nothing going on. They go and kill someone looking at it like, whatever, I'm going to end up in prison anyway. And he'd been released from Alaskan prison just a few months before he killed young Bonnie, and had also served time on assault charges, so they knew he was a violent offender as well. In May of 2007, Dion would be charged with Bonnie's rape and murder, and it's believed that the crime was a random act of violence. So he was just driving around that morning, saw this young woman walking in the darkness, either offered her a ride or forced her into the car, raped her, and seemingly threw her off that cliff. And he would get away with it for the next 12 years. At trial in May of 2011, he tried to excuse his behavior and say that he had consensual sex with her and that she had accidentally fell to her death, which is actually less believable than the police's initial story that she had just gone on this impromptu hike on the way to school and fallen off a cliff. This is even less believable than that. Clearly, you raped and killed her. Bro, just own up to it, you piece of shit. So on June 15th, 2011, Dion would be found guilty of her rape and murder, and on Halloween that year, he would be sentenced to 124 years in prison. Trick or treat, bitch. And so he will spend the rest of his life behind bars and die in prison, thankfully. And thanks not to the police work that was done in this, which was terrible, but thanks to DNA and technology, this fucker was caught, justice is served, and now the family can finally, you'll never be able to relax or move past it, but at least they can rest assured that the offender is behind bars and paying for what he did to their daughter, to their sister, their loved ones. So yeah, that's my case for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week.
You hush your mouth, boy.